Hello my friends, and welcome back to another Baldur's Gate 3 tier listing guide. Hope you're all doing well. Today, as part of my ongoing series looking at Baldur's Gate itemization, we're talking about amulets. Specifically, the remainder of the Act 1 amulets and the Act 2 amulets. I divided them this way because there are so many amulets in Act 1 and very, very few in Act 2, so to keep the videos a reasonable length, I decided to make the cut in the middle of Act 1, rather than have one really long and one really short one. By this point, you know the drill. You have seen previous tier lists, so you know how we are approaching rating these amulets and the definitions of the tiers, and if not, of course, you can refer to part 1 of this video, where I go over everything in more detail. Before I begin, I do want to take a quick moment to say thank you so much to Michael Meepoke for the $10 donation, Trengilly for the $10, Athena T for the $10, and Potato Man and Souls and Things for becoming channel members. Thank you so much, my friends. I really do appreciate the support. Alright, let's talk amulets. First up, the Silver Pendant. The Silver Pendant is available very early in Act 1, and gives you Guidance, the ability to cast the cantrip Guidance at will while you're wearing it. So basically you learn Guidance when you put it on. This is quite powerful because Guidance is probably the single best spell in the entire game. I've talked about Guidance extensively in my character guides and in my spells tier list, but passing skill checks is good, and Guidance has a massive impact on your ability to do that. Baldur's Gate's skill DCs kind of assume that you're casting Guidance on every skill check, and so you are definitely putting yourself in a hole if you aren't doing that. So you definitely want Guidance on every party. It's basically mandatory to have access to it for your honor mode runs. In fact, I would say that Guidance is almost certainly, for most Baldur's Gate parties, the single most common action that you're going to take across the entirety of your playthrough. You'll cast Guidance more often than you do anything else, except walk, I guess, and probably, attack, but as a single specific action, Guidance is going to be the most used one because it's just that prevalent and just that powerful and useful. My general suggestion is that you should try to have 2 copies of Guidance in every party, so that if you have a skill check you want to react to in another way with your normal Guidance caster, you can still cast Guidance as well as do that other thing, like add Bardic Inspiration or cast Enhance Ability or any other source of additional modifier to skill checks that would preclude you from casting Guidance. You definitely want to have it on a second character so that you can just do both. While most parties, I think, will probably have some character that can learn Guidance pretty easily at low opportunity cost, it can be difficult for some party compositions to have 2 characters with Guidance, and the Silver Pendant solves this. So, for any party that doesn't have a Guidance caster normally, the Silver Pendant is obviously critical, because it gives you access to one of the most important tools in the game. But also, even for parties that only just have one character that can cast Guidance, the Silver Pendant is still very, very relevant. This is an extremely important item to pay attention to, and you're definitely going to want it equipped for at least part of Act 1 before you have your skill checks sort of maximized. And if you don't have a Guidance caster, honestly, you may just want to leave this on for the entire game. It just makes your playthrough so much smoother to have access to Guidance that it can be worth giving up an amulet slot for a combat stat just to have access to the Silver Pendant. Of course, you can swap it in and out when you're going into conversation and when you're going into combat for skill checks, but even if you just wear this instead of another amulet, it will give you so much impact on your playthrough that it's absolutely worth it if you don't have Guidance normally on a character. For any party without Guidance, or for any party that needs a second copy, the Silver Pendant is S tier, one of the most important items in the game, and one that you should definitely rush to acquire, especially if you're leaving Shadowheart at home. The Tarnished Charm. The Tarnished Charm's tooltip says, makes it easier for the wearer to succeed on death saving throws, which doesn't tell you what it actually does at all. But what it does is it reduces the save DC for a death save to 5. So normally you need to roll an 11 or higher on a d20 to pass your death saving throw. With the Tarnished Charm, you need to roll a 5 or higher. So it's a slightly better than 50% increase to your chance of success on a death saving throw. That's kind of a ridiculous item to exist in the game alongside the Periaptive Wound Closure, which just immediately passes all of your death saving throws. So the Tarnished Charm for this extremely marginal effect is never going to come up. You will very rarely have a character who's actually rolling enough death saves that it matters. And if you do, something has definitely gone terribly wrong, and possibly could have been prevented if you equipped a real item rather than this item. The Tarnished Charm is one of the worst items in the game that actually has a positive effect, because its effect is so marginal. There's a couple that have purely negative effects that are worse, but for an item that nominally does something, the Tarnished Charm is quite possibly the single weakest item in the entire game. D tier. The Amulet of Lost Voices. The Amulet of Lost Voices allows you to cast Speak with Dead once per long rest, which is a 3rd level spell. So normally you'll get access to the Amulet of Lost Voices long before your characters can actually learn Speak with Dead. So if you want to talk with dead bodies in the early game, this is going to be the only way to do it. Speak with Dead is a 3rd level spell, meaning you need to be at least level 5. But it is a ritual spell, so it's not like the amulet is saving you valuable 3rd level spell slots later in the game, because Speak with Dead doesn't cost spell slots to actually use. It's just letting you get access to this effect much earlier, and use it without having a character who would normally have access to it, so for any party that doesn't have one, the Amulet of Lost Voices is great. The conversations with dead characters available in Baldur's Gate are awesome. They are really fun and definitely worth doing. If you haven't been doing it, definitely cast Speak with Dead more, because they put a lot of work into those conversations, and it really shows. Some characters will not want to talk to you, but you can use Disguise Self to get around that and still have the conversation with a character that you killed. So with that combination, you can experience all of that story content using the Amulet of Lost Voices. That being said, from a purely mechanical standpoint, Speak with Dead often isn't that critical. The game is designed in such a way that no quests require you to, or none that I can think of, maybe there's like 1 or 2, but very few quests actually require you to have Speak with Dead in order to solve them. There's usually skill checks or alternate methods that you can use. It's typically just one path for solving a bunch of quests, is to have access to Speak with Dead, so that you can talk to a dead character and get some more information or whatever. And there's also not many mechanical bonuses that you can get from talking to dead characters in terms of additional loot, additional power for your characters, additional buffs, anything along those lines. So, unlike Guidance, which similarly only works outside of combat, but has a huge mechanical impact on your playthrough, Speak with Dead is more for flavor, in terms of how you actually are approaching the game, and less in terms of maximizing your mechanical power. For that reason, I'm going to give it A tier, because it's still very good. It's a valuable tool to allow you to pass a bunch of quests more easily. The Amulet of Lost Voices is very much worth wearing. And I will say that I personally use this amulet basically the entire game, because I really enjoy those conversations. But looking at it from a sort of mathematical, purely mechanical standpoint in terms of increasing your character's power level, it's not necessary for most parties to use this. It just gives you a bunch of easier methods to complete a few quests. So A tier for the amulet, because it's free value, and who doesn't love free value? But the value it gives you in terms of power for your character isn't as high as some of the other out-of-combat options available on the amulet slot. That being said, you should just use this item. It's super fun, and definitely I would bring it everywhere. The Blast Pendant. The Blast Pendant is a slightly weird item. It has a kind of fiddly use pattern, and the play pattern to use it requires a specific setup. Basically how it works is that when you activate it, which requires an action, for the next 2 turns you get a buff that when you deal lightning damage with a spell or cantrip, it will consume all of your lightning charges and deal that much additional damage with your lightning spell. So the use pattern here, because lightning charges are somewhat difficult to generate outside of combat, and this takes an action to use, you want to use this during combat, because spending an action to give a +5 damage to your next spell is a terrible use of an action economy. What you're going to do is pre-cast this before entering combat, then generate a bunch of lightning charges on the first turn by, like, standing in an electrified puddle with the water sparkers, for example, and then cast Lightning Bolt on your first turn of combat, doing an additional 5 damage on the Lightning Bolt. That is an okay play pattern, a little bit fiddly to set up and does require you to have ways to gain lightning charges. But for spellcasters in the early game, the lightning charge set is one of the normal sets of items that you're going to use. The water sparkers and the ring that gives you immunity to electrocution are just a pretty good set for early game spellcasters, so having the lightning charges available isn't that difficult. If you don't have anything else that you want to cast before combat starts, then the Blast Pendant can be pretty useful. But if you have other pre-combat buffs that you want to use, which a lot of spellcasters will, then it's really hard to actually use this item because the buff only lasts for 2 turns. So if you have to spend your action on something else before combat begins, then you won't really get to use the Blast Pendant. Because it is so fiddly to use, and the bonus, while present, plus 4 or 5 damage on a lightning bolt can be, if you target it well, plus 12, plus 16 damage on a spell, which is obviously a lot of additional damage. Then the Blast Pendant has a moderate effect, but requires a lot of setup, makes it harder to use other pre-buffs, and is only very useful for specific characters. And so, even though it does do additional damage, and additional damage is one of the best things that you can be doing, I just don't think that this item is usually worth the effort. There are typically better things to spend your actions on before combat starts, and only very specific characters will be able to use the Blast Pendant anyways, so I'm going to put it in C tier, because the play pattern with this item is just too awkward to actually use in practice. The Ever-Seeing Eye. The Ever-Seeing Eye gives you the ability to cast Protection from Evil and Good once per short rest. Protection from Evil and Good is a powerful but situational spell, so getting it on an item that lets you cast it once per short rest is perfect, because that means you'll always have it available for combat where you want it, and you don't have to invest any character or build resources in actually learning or casting it. You get to save spell slots, and still have this effect for when you want it. It makes you immune to Frightened from Aberration, Celestials, Elementals, Fae, Fiends, and Undead, and there are a few enemies in the game who fit that description, who apply Frightened. The description of the spell also says it makes you immune to Charmed, but in Baldur's Gate it's bugged and doesn't actually make you immune to Charmed from those enemies, but Fear Immunity is still very relevant against a lot of enemies in the game. More importantly, though, it also gives them disadvantage on attack rolls against you, and Undead having disadvantage on attack rolls against you remains relevant basically throughout the entire game. So there's a lot of encounters where Protection from Evil and Good can be a pretty powerful tool for your party that you often don't want to invest resources into getting, so having this from an item is pretty good. By the time you get this item, it's possible that you've already done some of the fights where you would most want this effect, but even going on through Act 2, Protection from Evil and Good, because Act 2 has a lot of undead, is going to stay a very relevant effect that you can gain a lot of value out of. Just like all of the other situational but powerful spell effects that amulets give you, the Ever-Seeing Eye is B tier, because you're going to swap it in for some encounters, use the spell, and then not use it when you don't need it. Great option to have available. The Spectator Eyes. The Spectator Eyes give you 2 unique spells, each castable once per day. The first of these is Wounding Ray, which deals 2d8 necrotic damage with a Constitution save for half to a single enemy. At the point where you get this item, you're probably at or close to level 5, depending on what order you do the Act 1 in, and that's where your cantrips upgrade to probably do 2d8 or 2d10 damage, depending on what cantrips you're using. And so the Spectator Eyes are going to be just about on par with casting a cantrip for casters, and significantly worse than just making an attack for martial characters who at this point are getting access to extra attack. As a damage option, this just isn't very impressive. There are almost no characters that are interested in casting this, and the once per long rest cost is definitely real. It's a con save for half, and that does mean that it's a little better than a cantrip in some ways, because it is guaranteed damage. So you're always going to get at least some damage out of this, and you can use it to finish off low health enemies. So as a pure damage action, it's not particularly good, but it does give you a tool to finish off low health enemies without spending a real resource like a spell slot. The other of these spells is Ray of Fear, which once per long rest lets you force an enemy to make a wisdom saving throw or become frightened for 2 turns, which prevents them from moving and gives them disadvantage on attack rolls. This is, again, basically the same as the level 1 spell Dissonant Whispers, except without the damage component, because that frightens an enemy for 2 turns and does psychic damage as well. So while this is a moderately powerful effect, it's pretty easily duplicated by a bunch of other spell options that you have access to. So the only reason to use the Spectator Eyes is if you're doing really long adventuring days and running out of resources, where you might want these effects to kind of give yourself discount versions of what your character is already doing in terms of just casting Ray of Frost or using Dissonant Whispers. So the Spectator Eyes mostly is not going to be that interesting for most characters. These aren't terrible actions, but they are just so easily superseded by scrolls, by other item spellcasting, by your character's natural spellcasting, that I just don't think they're going to come up, and spending your whole amulet slot on equipping this I just don't think is worth it. I'm going to give it C tier because they're not totally useless, and for parties that are doing really long adventuring days, they could definitely come in handy. But other than that, you're better off just casting a spell. The Uncovered Mysteries. The Uncovered Mysteries gives you Detect Thoughts, castable once per long rest. Detect Thoughts is a ritual spell, so it's very similar to the Amulet of Lost Voices in that it gives you a ritual spell that's mostly useful outside of combat. So it's not going to save you any spell slots, and it is only a level 1 spell instead of a level 3 spell, so you don't get early access to this spell, but it can give access to Detect Thoughts to a character that wouldn't normally have access to it, opening up some options in dialogue. The difference, though, aside from being a level 1 spell rather than a level 3 spell, is that Detect Thoughts actually makes most dialogues harder when you cast it. The way that the save DCs on Detect Thoughts work versus the way skill checks work in Baldur's Gate means that if you're trying to succeed in a quest or succeed in a dialogue, using Detect Thoughts is almost always less likely to work than just trying to use a persuasion check or a normal skill check to achieve the same result. Most opportunities you have to use Detect Thoughts in dialogue, you are better off not doing so, and so having access to the spell can actually be actively harmful for you because it can bait you into using an option that's less likely to succeed. Outside of combat, though, outside of dialogue, though, Detect Thoughts also does have some usage. It's a ritual spell that requires your concentration and lasts all day, so it doesn't cost you a spell slot to use, and requires your concentration, which has some synergy with certain effects that want you to be concentrating on stuff. The ring that does additional psychic damage when you're concentrating, or the concentrated blast illithid power, rely on you having a concentration spell that doesn't require a resource to use, ideally, so that you can activate those effects pretty easily. The Uncovered Mysteries gives you one more source of that for a character that wouldn't normally have it, and so if you want those effects on a fighter or a ranger or somebody who can't cast a ritual spell, or a rogue or somebody who can't cast a ritual spell normally, then the Uncovered Mysteries can give that to you and let you use Concentrated Blast more frequently because you have a concentration spell available. That's a pretty narrow and marginal use case, in my opinion. It's only for certain kinds of characters who wouldn't have access to the spell otherwise, and it only works once per day because you don't get recast Detect Thoughts once you break concentration on it to cast Concentrated Blast or anything along those lines. And there's just easier ways to get stuff to concentrate on than to equip an entire amulet for it. So the Uncovered Mysteries mostly doesn't help you in dialogue because it actually actively makes dialogues harder, and mostly doesn't help you in combat because there's easier ways to get access to concentration effects for most characters that are less costly overall than spending an item slot on it. I'm going to give it C tier because technically you can use it to trigger those effects, so it's not entirely useless, but the Uncovered Mysteries for most parties is not going to be particularly important. So, that's all of the Act 1 amulets. So just to quickly sum up in Act 1, I think the lesson here is that Amulet is probably the item slot that you're going to be changing the most during an adventuring day, because so many of them are powerful but situational effects. Most parties are going to want the Silver Pendant equipped, most parties are going to be using the Pearl of Power, and the Psychic Spark is very useful for everyone. The Broodmother's Revenge, if you don't mind microing the healing, is of course excellent for a lot of parties as well. So that's a good setup, just in general, those 4 amulets, for the end of Act 1 for just a generically strong amulet setup. But the real key to amulets is all of the A and B tier amulets that you can swap in for certain encounters. So one thing that you should be thinking of when you go into various encounters in Act 1 and on later into the game is, what spell effects are going to be useful in this encounter should I equip a different amulet to get access to that spell effect? Because so many of them have bound spells that are situational, so you don't want to learn or prepare them on your spellcasters, but you can swap in your amulet to precast them before combat without spending a spell slot, or use them during combat. All of those make Amulet a pretty flexible and useful gear slot that really helps shore up the gaps in your party by giving you access to effects that you normally wouldn't have. The Amulet of Restoration. The Amulet of Restoration's a weird one, because it has 2 possible spawn locations in the game, and can show up at both of them. And one of them is in Act 1, and one of them is in Act 2. You are not guaranteed to see this item in Act 1. I've had runs where it doesn't spawn in Act 1, and so I'm treating it as an Act 2 amulet, because although it can show up during Act 1, it's not necessarily going to, and for a roguelike run, an honor mode run, I like to assume the worst, because you definitely don't want to plan around something that is potentially not going to happen. So I'm treating it as though it's an Act 2 item, although obviously sometimes it can show up in Act 1, and that's really good because then you get access to it earlier. The Amulet of Restoration lets you cast Healing Word and Mass Healing Word, each once per long rest. Healing Word is one of my favorite spells in the game. It's just a great emergency button to have. It also is a great way to apply the buff on heal item set, and Mass Healing Word is an incredible upgrade for that. These are extremely powerful, but relatively situational spells, so perfect for an amulet slot, because you don't necessarily want to spend a level 3 spell slot on casting Mass Healing Word, but getting it from an amulet makes it a really good option to have in your back pocket. If 2 of your companions go down, you can bring them back up in a single bonus action with Mass Healing Word, which is great action economy and very efficient for your party. In addition to that, characters that are using the buff on heal item set will probably be preparing and casting Mass Healing Word anyways, because when it also casts Bless and Blade Ward, Mass Healing Word is still worth a level 3 spell slot, so getting an extra one of those is really, really powerful for that kind of character. Even if you don't find this item until Act 2, I think it's going to make its way into many parties, because it just gives you so much safety and access to so many panic buttons, which are very important to have in honor mode, because if something goes wrong, you really want to be able to fix it. As well, it lets you use the buff on heal item set, one of the more powerful defensive tools in the game, even more efficiently. If you find this item in Act 1, obviously it's correspondingly even better, because the spells are relatively more powerful compared to your hit points and incoming damage, and the buff on heal item set is at its best in Act 1, so the Amulet of Restoration is incredible if you find it in Act 1, but even in Act 2, I think this is just an incredibly strong amulet that's gonna be a mainstay of most parties. Some characters should have this equipped, and it's going into S tier. The Amulet of the Harpers. More bangers in Act 2. The Amulet of the Harpers gives you advantage on wisdom saving throws, and shield once per long rest. Shield is obviously only a level 1 spell, so this is basically +1 level 1 spell slot, but of course this can be used by characters that don't normally have access to shield. Something that I talk about a lot in my Eldritch Knight builds, which get shield as part of their Eldritch Knight spells, is how good shield is on characters that don't normally get it. Taking a martial character from 22 to 27 AC means you're just not taking any hits that round. And because shield lasts for the entire round, a character who's out of position can use it on the first attack and basically prevent themselves from taking damage for the entire round. Once per long rest is definitely a restrictive cooldown, but the shield spell is such a great defensive option to have, especially on characters that don't normally get access to it, that it's really incredibly strong to have even only once per day. Especially if your character is one that doesn't normally get a reaction that's particularly useful. Shield gives you a way to use that combat resource more effectively, and can keep any character alive. This synergizes very well with advantage on wisdom saving throws. Often, martial characters who have high armor class and benefit the most from the Amulet of the Harpers will have low wisdom saves, and one of the only ways a character who has shield and high armor class can lose fights is by getting crowd controlled by a wisdom saving throw targeting effect. Many of which are very dangerous, and many of which show up in Act 2, so you really want to have good protection against those during your Act 2 combats. The Amulet of the Harpers gives you both in one package in a relatively inexpensive item slot, and so is really useful for a wide variety of characters. Spellcasters can use it to give themselves an additional cast of shield, or on a cleric or something to make themselves more protected. This also helps a cleric maintain concentration on spirit guardians, because if they were going to take a hit, despite their high armor class and radiating orbs potentially and stuff like that, you can prevent it with shield, and gives you advantage on wisdom saves to make your already high wisdom saving throw even better. Basically, the Amulet of the Harpers is going to go on someone in your party, and it's always going to be good. So I'm going to give this one also S tier, because it's such a powerful effect on such a relatively inexpensive item slot that the Amulet of the Harpers is just a really solid option, and don't underestimate how much it increases the survivability of your character. The Fireheart. The Fireheart gives you 2 turns of heat whenever you take fire damage dealt by another creature. Heat will build up to a maximum of 7 stacks and then discharge on your next fire damage effect for plus damage equal to the number of heat stacks. It works well with AoE spells like Fireball because it'll deal plus 7 damage to everything hit by the Fireball. This is a funny way to build up heat, because the fire damage just has to come from another creature, not from an enemy. So you can have an ally hit you with fire damage in order to charge heat and then enter combat and hurl a fireball at an enemy, which is a funny but very dumb strategy that I don't recommend, because that means that you have to take a bunch of damage before you go into combat. Maybe for some combats where there's a bunch of low health grouped enemies and you know you're going to be able to start it off by like invisibly sneaking in and launching a fireball or something that's charged to maximum with stacks of heat, you can get plus 7 damage. Honestly, I'm really reaching here because I'm looking for any use for this item. Even if you try to cheese it by dealing damage to your party members in order to charge the heat effect, it's just not particularly powerful. There's better sources of heat. And if you try to use this item as it's intended to be used, it's complete trash. So, D tier for the Fireheart. The Frost Prince. The Frost Prince gives you Ice Knife once per long rest, the level 1 spell Ice Knife. Ice Knife isn't a bad spell, especially in the early game. It creates an ice surface and can knock over enemies, but, I mean, come on, this is Act 2. A level 1 spell once per long rest is not really what we're interested in anymore, so the Frost Prince is just not going to be cutting it at this point in the game. D tier. The Hammergrim Mist Amulet. The Hammergrim Mist Amulet lets you cast Fog Cloud at will. So this is a level 1 spell, just like the Frost Prince, but the difference between casting it once per long rest and casting it at will is pretty impressive. Having access to Fog Cloud all of the time is quite good. Fog Cloud isn't a spell you're going to be using every combat, but when you do use it, it's probably going to win that combat. Against enemies who can't easily get out of it, it's an incredibly powerful crowd control effect. Fog Cloud is blindness without any saving throw. So enemies who can't leave it because you've locked them down or because they are sort of inherently immobile, are just going to be absolutely annihilated by having Fog Cloud put on top of them. Flog Cloud. Because this is just a very powerful crowd control effect, and no saving throw effects are very, very good in a game where a big part of what you're trying to do is overcome randomness. while many parties will have access to Fog Cloud naturally, being able to save spell slots on it is definitely pretty useful. And so the Hammergrim Mist Amulet is an amulet that you definitely should consider, because Fog Cloud's just a powerful effect. In fact, I would say that Fog Cloud is probably one of the most underrated effects, one of the most underrated spells in Baldur's Gate 3. I see a lot of people often ask why you should take this spell, and the answer is that blinding enemies without a saving throw is incredibly strong, often worth an action, so the Hammergrim Mist Amulet gives you access to that even if you wouldn't normally have it. That being said, it's not a spell that you're going to be spamming every turn of combat, so getting it at will isn't hugely more impactful than getting it like once per short rest or something like that. So while it's cool that it's at will, it's not ridiculous. And you've already had the Cloak of Cunning Broom for a long time, so you can use that. If you were using Fog Cloud to like steal from merchants, you already had access to that. The Hammergrim Mist Amulet I'm going to put in B tier, because it's a very strong effect, and it can enable some pretty funny things, just casting Fog Cloud every turn of combat, chasing enemies around the battlefield with it, because the enemies will try to run away to leave the Fog Cloud, and depending on where you're positioned with the AI, you can also force them to like run in goofy circles and do nothing with their turns by Fog Clouding them over and over. This is a spell that you will have access to from scrolls and other options at this point, so while this saves you some resources, it's not going to give you a new tool that you didn't already have. Shar's Temptation. Shar's Temptation lets you cast Charm Person, another level 1 spell, this time once per short rest. These all have different cooldowns. Charm Person once per short rest is basically, if you don't have friends and want that effect, then you can use this amulet rather than spending a level 2 spell on enhanceability for charisma. It's the same as Friends, where you have to leave the area or disguise yourself or in some other way get out of having committed a crime before the end of the duration. And a lot of parties will have access to this as a cantrip rather than needing to invest an item slot in it, but yeah, I guess you can use it. In combat, Charm Person's basically useless because it only stops them from attacking the caster, so they'll continue to attack the rest of your party, even if you do happen to land the effect on them, which they get saving throws against anyways. So basically this is, do you not have friends in your party and want it, then the Shar's Temptation might be okay. C tier for parties that fit that very specific requirement. The Spellcrux Amulet. This lets you, once per long rest, restore any spell slot as a bonus action, so you can even use it in combat to recover a spell that you just cast the previous turn and cast it again. I mean, you thought the Pearl of Power was good. This is the Pearl of Ultimate Cosmic Power. It doesn't even come with an itty-bitty living space. The Spellcrux Amulet, obviously, is incredibly powerful. This can be a 6th level spell slot, which is probably the single most valuable resource for your party across the entire game. So you can use it to cast a summon or a Hero's Feast at the beginning of the day and still have your 6th level spell slot for combat. You can use it to restore your action and cast a second, restore your spell slot and cast a second 6th level spell in a combat. If you're hasted, you can even do all of that in the same turn, because you can spend your action to cast Chain Lightning, bonus action Spellcrux Amulet, and then spend your second action to Chain Lightning again. The Spellcrux Amulet is obviously incredibly busted. It gives you the most powerful resource in the game, basically for free, and you can even use it in combat. It's most typically, I would say, used for a powerful day-long level 6 buff, like a summon or Hero's Feast, and then still having those spells for spell slots for combat. But the Spellcrux Amulet, yeah, obviously this is incredible, S tier. The Spineshudder Amulet. Aside from having an awesome name, the Spineshudder Amulet gives you, whenever you deal damage with a ranged spell attack, you also do 2 turns of Reverberation. So basically any ray attacks, like Scorching Ray, Eldritch Blast, Ray of Frost, etc., will also add 2 turns of Reverberation. You can combine this with other sources of Reverberation to add a bunch of Reverberation to your cantrips, which is pretty good, because if a cantrip also stacks 6 Reverberation stacks and knocks over an enemy, then that's a really powerful use of a cantrip. In addition to that, with spells that apply multiple damage instances, this stacks it up immediately. So it turns your 3 Eldritch Blast shots into Eldritch Blast and Prone. It turns your Scorching Ray into Scorching Ray and knock an enemy prone. So the Spineshudder Amulet is just awesome. For Warlock, basically, I think this is what you almost always want, because you're doing Eldritch Blast attacks, so you're just applying Reverberation in addition to your Eldritch Blast shots, a ton of additional damage, and Reverberation is just great in general. You can use that to then trigger more things that apply when you inflict a condition on an enemy, and so on and so forth, to really stack up debuffs and effects alongside your Eldritch Blast damage, which is already really good. Basically, this item is for Warlocks, but for pretty much any character that is doing ranged spell attacks, the Spineshudder Amulet is at least worth considering, because Reverberation is such a powerful effect, but on multi-hit spells, this item is busted, S tier. The Strange Tendril Amulet. This is another amulet with a bound spell. It lets you cast Evard's Black Tentacles once per long rest. That's a 4th level spell slot for your amulet, and Evard's Black Tentacles is one of those spells that I usually don't end up taking on a character, because when it costs a 4th level spell to use, it's not a terribly strong use of a 4th level spell. But when you get it for free, it's great. Evard's Black Tentacles is an awesome combination with other crowd control spells or other damaging surfaces. It won't get lit on fire by Wall of Fire, so you can keep enemies trapped in a Wall of Fire. It will combine to keep enemies stuck in Hunger of Hadar, and an enemy who's trapped in Hunger of Hadar basically can't do anything. So the Strange Tendril Amulet is part of making, microwave combos, where you can just keep enemies locked in areas of pain and just win entire encounters, and also just a solid spell to have access to when you don't have to spend a spell slot on it. You might be surprised, because I rated Evard's Black Tentacles pretty low in my spells tier list, but the difference between a spell that you have to spend resources on and a spell that you get for free is massive. When it costs 0, it's great. The Strange Tendril Amulet I'm going to put in A tier, because you're going to swap it sort of in and out. Obviously, you don't need it equipped after you've already used it for the day, but it's definitely one that you should keep in mind because of how powerful the effect is. A 4th level spell slot once per day is great, even when it's restricted to a specific spell. In this case, that spell is also a good one to have once per day, because it's on the weaker end, just because it's a little more situational than a lot of other spells, which is perfect for one that you just get once per day. And finally, for Act 2, the Surgeon's Subjugation Amulet. The Surgeon's Subjugation Amulet gives you once per long rest when you score a critical hit on a humanoid enemy, or I guess ally if you want to use it on them. You can paralyze the target for 2 turns. You spend your reaction to do this, so you won't have your reaction for the next round of combat, and it only is activatable once per long rest, but there's no saving throw on this effect. All you have to do is get a critical hit, and you can paralyze an enemy with no saving throw. Even with all the restrictions and the cooldown, no save paralysis is incredibly strong. If you get a critical hit on an enemy and are able to paralyze them, that almost certainly instantly wins the combat if it's an important enemy. This, again, is only usable once per day, but you get to choose when you use it, so you don't have to activate it on an enemy who's near death, or an enemy who's not particularly important to kill. If you critically hit them, you can activate it on any enemy. It also works off any critical hit, so it can work off of ranged attacks, it can work off of spell criticals, so a Great Old One Warlock can use this, alongside their critical hit fear to do fear and paralysis on enemies. The challenge for Warlocks, of course, is that it competes with the Spineshudder Amulet, which is a permanent passive benefit, so overall I like it a little bit more. But in general, the Surgeon's Subjugation Amulet will be very good for any character that's stacking critical hit chance, because no save paralysis is excellent. Because, again, this only works once per day, I'm going to give it A tier, because this is one that you will want to use for encounters where there are humanoid enemies, and specifically ones with lots of health, so it's relevant to paralyze them, and you're relatively likely to get a critical hit against them to be able to activate it. But when you do use this effect, it's incredibly powerful. So, at the end of Act 2, you can see that you've gotten a tremendous amount of upgrades for your amulet slot, and a lot of options as to what you're using depending on your party. You're also going to be swapping them in and out even more aggressively, probably, than you were at the end of Act 1, because there's so many cool options that you get to use once per day, and these can really shore up your party's weaknesses in encounters where those options are good. The Spellcrux Amulet, of course, is going to be a mainstay throughout the entire day, and the Amulet of the Harpers and Amulet of Restoration are just both good to have equipped on your party. By this point, you probably will have access to guidance on some character if you're multi-classing your parties at all. If you don't, you can still keep the Silver Pendant, but otherwise you may be able to unequip that at this point. And some of the other amulets like the Psychic Spark have started to drop off unless you're specifically built around them. So you're very likely to have like these 3 amulets equipped, Spineshudder, Harpers, and Restoration, and then be using the 4th character as a flex slot for whichever utility amulet you need. Then, of course, you also have all of the A and B tier amulets that provide you a ton of different options, depending on what your builds and your parties need, and come in for certain encounters to basically solve those encounters. So again, keep in mind that you can always swap your gear depending on what you need at that given moment. Alright, my friends, I hope that you enjoyed this look at the Act 2 amulets and the end of the Act 1 amulets. As always, if there's something you think that I should be moving around, or that I've missed the point of a specific item, then definitely do let me know in the comments. Always happy to move things around if people have good reasons to do so, and we've done that in the past. And if you enjoyed the video, please feel free to leave a comment and hit like. It helps me out with the algorithm, so do appreciate you taking the time to do that. And of course, you can subscribe to my channel to be notified when Part 3 shows up. Also, I should mention this, I always forget to mention this. If you hit the bell on my channel, you'll get notifications when I post a video. YouTube sometimes will just not show people videos from channels they're subscribed to, even if normally they would watch them. Because it wants you to like get hooked on a whole new thing, even if you're happy to continue to watch the thing you were already enjoying. So that's a way to mitigate the algorithm trying to mess with you and pull you away from content that you're enjoying if you turn on channel notifications. It also, I think, is a metric that they use to determine whether people like your channel or not, so it does help me out. And of course, we will be back with Part 3 of this tier list, future tier lists, and other strategy game analysis, including for Baldur's Gate, and I will catch you next time. Cheers, folks. GG.